China has been the world's economic miracle story of the last 50 years. Since the People's Republic began to open its economy to the world in 1978, China has gone from an impoverished backwater to one of the centers of the global economic system. GDP growth has averaged 9.32% over the 44 years since it opened up. China has become the world's second largest economy by nominal GDP and has even surpassed the United States when measured in GDP by purchasing power parity. In sure signs of its economic strength, China managed to avoid recession during both the global financial crisis of 2008 and the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 to 2021. However, since 2010, when it surpassed Japan to become the world's second largest economy, the trend has been clear. China's rate of economic growth is slowing down. The country grew by only 2.99% in 2022, which is low by its standards. What is going on in China's economy, and what does it mean for that country and the security of the Indo-Pacific region? Since the internal chaos in China ended with Mao's death, the Chinese Communist Party has maintained power on an implicit promise. It would still rule in an authoritarian manner, but in exchange, the people would get the benefit of security and fast economic growth. So far, the party has managed to fulfill this promise. Made in China has practically become an institution in the global economy. The People's Republic has entrenched itself at the heart of the world's supply chain, and not just in cheap manufactured goods either. China dominates the manufacturing process of many of the world's most important supply chains. For example, it holds a near-monopoly position in the rare earth elements that are crucial raw components for the modern digital economy. China controls 50 to 60% of the mining market for these materials, and 90% of the intermediate processing stage. China's GDP per capita has risen from $156.4 in 1978 to $12,720 in 2022. However, this period of breakneck, unprecedented economic growth came with hidden costs, and those cracks in the foundation are now beginning to show. One of the most important of these problems is China's looming demographic plunge. Long the world's most populous country, China peaked in population in about 2020 and has now begun a slow decline. UN sources estimate that India surpassed it as the world's most highly populated country in April 2023. By the end of the century, demographers predict that China will have about 776 million people, a little over half of what it has today. This is bad enough for the Chinese economy, but hidden beneath these raw numbers are trends that are arguably worse. China's working population peaked at about 763.5 million in 2014. In 2022, it had shrunk to 733.5 million. The World Bank warned in 2016 that by 2040, China's working-age population could shrink by over 10%. Meanwhile, the elderly are growing as a share of the Chinese population, and it is happening at a rapid rate. In 2015, there were 136.9 million people over the age of 65 in China, which is more than Japan's entire population, and the trend will accelerate. By 2030, China's 65 and over population will be 238.8 million, more than Japan and Egypt's combined total populations. By 2050, China's elderly will be almost 350 million strong, equal to the total combined populations of Japan, Egypt, Australia, and Germany. There is also a comparative lack of younger people in China to support these aging people compared to that seen in other countries. This problem comes as a result of China's one-child policy, which was implemented between 1979 and 2015 as a way to curb the supposed problem of overpopulation. Although the policy was modified to 2 children in 2015 and all limits on childbirth were removed in 2021, the consequences of this policy will be felt for many years to come. For nearly 40 years, the one-child policy limited the growth of the younger cohorts of China's population. The Chinese government has been trying to encourage women to have more children, but in this it's facing another hurdle the one-child policy created for so long. China has a serious shortage of women of childbearing age. Chinese families have long had cultural preferences for sons over daughters. The inability for families to have more than one child meant that female fetuses were preferentially aborted during the years the one-child policy was in place. Infanticide and abandonment of daughters were also widespread in certain areas. One 2015 study found that in some areas where it was common, as many as 1 in 10 baby girls were abandoned in the 1990s. Lucky abandoned girls were adopted by families abroad. Others faced social disadvantages in their adopted family homes. Unlucky ones did not survive. Another 2015 study estimated that there were 62 million missing women in China, women who would be alive today if not for the one-child policy and the preference for male births. Because of the combination of these cultural practices and the draconian one-child policy, millions of Chinese men cannot find wives. In 2021, there were about 30 million more men than women in China, and the gap is widening. Perhaps unsurprisingly, China's fertility rate has fallen to a historic low of 1.23 births per woman. The easing and eventual overturning of the one-child policy has not been enough to stop this trend. Child rearing is also expensive, as raising one child to the age of 18 costs nearly 7 times China's GDP per capita, and China's draconian response to the COVID-19 pandemic ensured that even expecting mothers had limited hospital access, further disincentivizing women from having children. Why are these demographic issues so problematic for China going forward? Because the country has long relied on a young and mobile workforce. Productivity will therefore decrease as this cohort become less of a presence in the overall population. The shortage of workers, especially in the country's all-important manufacturing sector, will lead to increased wages and reduced profitability for the companies involved, making China less of an attractive place to invest. As India's population grows and remains younger than China, companies will likely see it as a more attractive place to allocate capital to, as its workforce proportion will increase in population relative to China. Meanwhile, China's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, its draconian zero-COVID policy, with frequent lockdowns that lasted from January 2020 to December 2022, has done more than harm expecting mothers. It's disrupted China's supply chains, further increasing the incentive for foreign investors to park their manufacturing elsewhere. To make matters worse, China's population is aging at an earlier stage of the country's national development than that seen in places like Japan or Europe. China will therefore need to adjust how it cares for its elderly. This is expensive and will require institutional changes, particularly as there are fewer younger working people to care for their elderly relatives, which has been the cultural norm in China up until now. Without institutional support, the growing cost of elder care will even further disincentivize young people from having children, making for an even worse demographic problem in the future. China may need to look at its neighbor Japan for a model on how to take care of an increasingly elderly population. However, China's economy faces shorter-term challenges as well. One of the nagging problems is that its Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, which was one of the centerpieces announcing China's arrival as a supposed global financial powerhouse, is rapidly becoming a trillion-dollar disaster. In 2013, China began the BRI as a means to expand its influence. By investing in the infrastructure of so many nations on the Eurasian landmass and the African continent, China could reorient world commerce away from the United States and toward routes that converge on Beijing, routes conveniently harder for the American military to reach. However, these investments have not been able to deliver on the ambitions Beijing had for them. Examples of less than optimal results abound, from Kenya's railroad to nowhere, to the financial failure of Sri Lanka's Hambantota port, to the scaling back of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC. Originally worth $62 billion, CPEC has been subject to corruption, financial setbacks, and terrorist attacks. The project's crown jewel, the port of Gwadar on the Indian Ocean, did not meet the financial expectations that China or Pakistan believed that improvements to the port would afford it. The lack of performance of CPEC has swelled Pakistan's national debt and forced the country to take a $6.3 billion bailout from the IMF. In fact, China's financial practices for its BRI have set the ambitious scheme up for failure. While infrastructure investments from Western countries typically have low interest rates over 30-year periods, China's BRI can have interest rates as high as 7% for half that time span. China also imposes coercive terms in lending the money. It can call in debts at any time, and often prohibits the debtor countries from getting refinancing or being able to restructure their payments. These terms have now had some unexpected consequences for the creditor country. Firstly, the BRI is not meeting its expectations, and the costs involved to the debtor countries have prompted participants to leave. Italy and the Philippines were two of the most important countries to join the BRI, as China's gaining influence within them could have given it some leverage over the US-led alliance system. However, both of them pulled out of the BRI in 2023. As BRI-related projects have often not delivered on their promises, more countries are reassessing or leaving China's infrastructure program. Meanwhile, as the countries that have taken Chinese money often have trouble paying back the funds, those outstanding debts have become a problem for the creditor country. China's BRI began with a lending spree on terms that seemed lopsided in Beijing's favor. Unfortunately for Beijing, when the creditor lends $1 trillion, that creditor is placing itself in a position of vulnerability. By lending so much under such harsh conditions to less than creditworthy customers and projects, China was taking as big of a gamble as the debtor countries. The numbers bear this out. In 2010, only 5% of China's overseas lending portfolio went to parties that were in financial distress. In 2023, that number is 60%. The end result is that Beijing now has a major problem on its hands in getting the money back. China has needed to issue $240 billion in emergency loans to 22 countries. 80% of those loans came between 2016 and 21. However, those bailouts didn't come cheaply. The debtor countries needed to take a 5% interest rate, over twice that charged by the IMF under similar circumstances. This dynamic raises longer-term questions about the sustainability of Chinese BRI debt and whether China will ever get its money back. The BRI is also slowing down. As countries grow more worried about China's international ambitions, especially in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, they have been more concerned about the security risks of the BRI and hesitant to start new projects under its banner. Although secondary to the worries over security risks, environmental concerns have also been increasing in relation to the BRI, causing additional hesitance. China has attempted to address the environmental concerns. In 2019, the leadership in Beijing pledged to reformat the BRI into an open, clean, and green project. However, there is little indication that environmental contingencies are taking place in existing BRI projects, and China's response to the COVID-19 pandemic and its wolf warrior diplomacy have further increased skepticism of Beijing's initiative abroad. The United States is also making it more difficult for China to implement the BRI. America's sanctions on Chinese state-owned firms, many of which have been heavily involved in the BRI, increase the hesitance of third-party organizations to work with them. For example, China has already asked for collaborations with third parties in the marketplace to reduce the costs of financing the BRI, attempting to collaborate with France, Italy, and Singapore in the process. However, because of American sanctions on Chinese companies involved in the BRI, these third parties that China is attempting to bring on board are more hesitant to offer assistance, leaving China on the hook and hoping it gets its money back. China's BRI is therefore facing problems, which now threaten to undermine the homeland's economy and contribute to China's own considerable financial problems. As China grew so rapidly, it went on a lending spree at home just as much as it did with the BRI abroad. The lending spree is now creating problems in the Chinese domestic economy. One of these is in the growing debt problems faced by municipalities in China. For example, Wuhan, the largest city in central China and the origin of the COVID-19 pandemic, has been forced to call in the loans it extended to hundreds of local entities. According to the city's finance bureau, 259 entities owe it a combined total equivalent to $14 million. These organizations include public and private companies, government departments, and even think tanks. Another consequence of China's zero-COVID policy was to drain the budget of many municipal and provincial governments, adding to the provincial and municipal debt problems. The lockdowns prevented economic activity, while governments were forced to spend large amounts of money on frequent mass testing programs and quarantine centers. To further illustrate the problem, Guangdong province alone spent $22 billion on the zero-COVID policy, while revenues declined sharply. Tax breaks to businesses hit hard by China's zero-COVID policy have also contributed to declining revenues and reduced local government services. Over $524 billion worth of such tax breaks were granted by government entities across China. In total, China could have outstanding government debt over $18 trillion, $10 trillion of which is hidden debt that riskier local government financing agents owe. Some of China's cities have responded by reducing medical spending for the country's growing elderly population, cutting transportation services and lowering fuel subsidies. Chinese municipalities have also been forced to reduce wages paid to government employees. Even wealthier provinces like Guangdong, Zhejiang, and Jiangsu have forced their workforces to take 30% pay cuts. Overall, in the span between 2016 and 2023, China's government debt grew from a 47% ratio of its GDP to 102%. This ratio is still behind the United States at 122% of GDP, but the debt growth rate in China has been far steeper. China's real estate problems are adding to the problems of government debt and economic weakness. Land sales make up about 40% of the revenues for local governments in China. Unfortunately for them, these have been in decline after a long period of expansion. Between January and October 2022, land sales in China fell by 26% from the same span in 2021. China's real estate developers are losing revenue as well due to collapsing home sales. Data released by China's 100 biggest property developers show that new home sales were 33% lower in July 2023 than they were a year earlier. China's largest property developer, Country Garden, abruptly withdrew from an attempt to raise $300 million in new shares on the news of the decline in home sales. In October 2023, international observers believed that Country Garden had defaulted on its foreign debt payments. International bondholders were reported in Reuters as seeking urgent talks with the company. Country Garden's troubles are far from an isolated case. In 2021, China saw a wave of defaults by major property developers. Evergrande, another of China's behemoth real estate developers, was declared to be in default in December of that year, failing to make $82.5 billion worth of interest payments. Evergrande has since gone into bankruptcy. The Evergrande problems accompanied those of Caesar, another property developer, which had its shares halted on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange after it became unlikely to meet a $400 million offshore debt deadline. China's real estate market was critical to its rise as an economic powerhouse, making up as much as 30% of its GDP. Overexpansion of the property market, however, has long led investors and foreign observers to point out a bubble in the real estate sector. China's ghost cities have become a frequent item of international attention. There may be as many as 50 of these cities at various stages of development. Originally, these were intended to redistribute some economic opportunities and give rural people somewhere else to go than China's huge coastal cities. However, these developments have often not delivered on their promises to investors. There may be as many as 50 million empty apartments in these developments, which have few or no residents in total, which means they are not returning the capital that was spent in creating them. Chinese authorities have tried to shore up the property market and have at times demonstrated the ability to develop cities from scratch. The Pudong district in Shanghai was once a swamp. Today it has a population of about 5.6 million. The ingredients for success in the top-down developmental approach are availability of jobs and transportation, but it's far from certain if China will be able to translate the success of Pudong to the other ghost cities located further away from China's coastal heartland. China's demographic problems will also present an increasing challenge to the unused property that attracted so much capital during the expansion phase. Less people means less demand for the large amounts of homes and shopping centers that China has accumulated over the years. China's economy has also become less productive because of its increasing politicization. The frequent embedding of Communist Party members in private companies and the authorities favoring state-owned companies over private ones has made domestic investors nervous and foreign investors even more leery about putting their money into Chinese enterprises. China's ability to keep itself at the center of existing supply chains and entrench itself at the center of future supply chains will be put further into question. China has become a colossus in the global economy, but some of the measures it took over the years to ensure its continued growth increasingly look like they have proven short-sighted. With aversion from international investors, sanctions from the United States, and fewer people to make purchases in real property or in consumer goods, China's economic growth will continue to slow down. And with uncertain debt structures both at home and abroad, a Chinese financial crisis seems inevitable. Meanwhile, China's increasing economic weakness could pose even more security challenges in the Indo-Pacific region. China has invested much of its wealth into its military buildup, and with economic troubles growing, Beijing might get the impression that it needs to use its military power to remake the order in the region now, when it still has the chance, and the inertia from its period of economic growth is still going. This is why many American military leaders and national security experts worry about an invasion of Taiwan before 2030. The situation, with the growing regional power close to peaking in its influence, resembles that seen in Germany before World War I. But do you think the same? What do you think are some of the challenges facing the Chinese economy as we move into the second quarter of the 21st century? Will China's economic problems add to a short-term security challenge for the Indo-Pacific region? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. And make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons to support the channel and get more military analysis from military experts.